Oh. It needs to be like moved over. Oh, great, thank you. Oh, okay, go over here. Okay. Hi, my name is Laura, and I'm a Python developer in New York. And previously, I worked on the Warehouse project to modernize the Python package index. Now I work at Datadog, and we are hiring. Come talk to me afterwards if you're interested. So as developers, we may need to write the same or similar code over and over. Come on. All right. You want to work now? There you go. Okay. So as developers, we may need to write the same or similar code over and over. We don't want to reinvent the wheel or repeat ourselves. If you have a single feature or piece of functionality on your Django project that you might want to use on another site, you might consider making it a package. This talk is for people who want to make Django packages to share on PyPI or with their coworkers, or who are curious about what goes into packaging a Django app. I'm going to share best practices for creating and distributing Django apps via PyPI. And I'm not going to cover a certain number of topics because of time constraints. I'm not going to cover an extensive discussion of security, an extensive discussion of licensing or how to choose a license, which is a talk unto itself. I'm not going to cover open sourcing your package beyond making the code available to users on a code hosting site. And I'm not going to discuss open source community building or cultivation. So Django is a Python web framework that uses a model view template pattern. It's good for building complex and database-driven websites. It comes with a built-in ORM and templating system, built-in admin page that allows for creating and updating site content. It was created in Kansas at the Lawrence Journal World and released as an open source framework in 2005. Also, it comes with a magic pony. So a Django project is a collection of settings for an instance of Django, including database configuration, Django-specific options, and application-specific settings. An app is a self-contained part of that project that might be taken off the initial Django project and reused on another one. The Django project has a file called settings.py, which contains a list called installed apps. Installed apps specifies one or more Django applications to be installed on the project. Each application has its own models, views, and forms that live in the same directory as the rest of the app. And applications are the fun part of Django. You can customize what your project does based on the apps you write and install. So apps do things. They do things like store and display blog posts, add a contact form, collect and display votes in a poll, or sign up new users, or search a REST API, or add search functionality or REST API. And I'm going to discuss later what makes a good app for packaging. Packaging one of these apps from a Django project is very straightforward. All you have to do is make sure your templates and other app resources are in the same directory as your app, and then recursively copy the directory to a folder outside of your project, and the app is ready for packaging. So what is a package? We're all familiar with the import statement, and packages are importable. You can use the import syntax with them. Most packages give us access to useful bits of code that are not in our current Python file. So using them is like choosing chocolates from a chocolate box. Package, however, is an overloaded term. Packages may contain many files or submodules. Modules, however, are a single file of Python code. So all packages are modules, but not all modules are packages. And a distribution, which I'll discuss later, is a package that has a version and is ready for publication. So Django apps are mostly Python code. Django apps can also be packaged and pip installed. But instead of using bits and pieces of a Django app, you install the whole app in your Django project, sort of like adding a melted chunk of chocolate to a recipe when you're making chocolate cake or chocolate sauce. Most apps in Django projects are installed by adding to installed apps in settings.py. After installing and adding its URLs to the URL conf, though some apps may require some other steps when they're installed. A simple project may contain a handful of apps, such as the Django Girls blog or the polls app from the Django docs. But a complex project may have tens or even hundreds of installed apps, which is a lot of chocolate. A good app candidate for packaging follows the Unix philosophy that it does one thing and does it well. So for instance, in Unix we have ls, which lists files in a directory and information about them, like permissions and types. ls doesn't search files, and it doesn't edit them. And you should aim to have a similar goal for your Django app. You should be able to explain what your app does in 1 or 2 brief sentences. My app signs up new users. My app shows blog entries. My app collects votes in a poll and displays them. Installation of your app should be minimally invasive, so even though you love the SQL ORM or SQL Alchemy, don't substitute it for the Django ORM, please. Make sure that all of the files relevant to your app are in the app directory so that you don't have any templates that are outside it and in your main Django project. Don't set things in your app in stone. Supply some basic templates or a default form class, but let the user substitute another if they wish. Don't make assumptions about where your app will live. And don't force people to do strange things with their Python path in order to import it. It's also a good idea in your app to use URL namespaces. This is because other installed apps in a really large Django project may have identical URLs to the ones you're using. When you're setting up your app, you might consider using a source directory. The source directory sits one level down from the main folder of your repository. And a source directory forces you to pip install your app in order for tests to work. So this makes sure that pip install works and works the way that you'd expect it to. Also, it allows your test runner to import your code as like a package. And now that I've mentioned tests, please have tests. If you don't ship a skeleton Django project with your package or ship some scripts to emulate it, your tests, if your user tries to run it, will probably fail. And tests will lead to better contributions from you and from other people. I'm going to speak briefly now about choosing your name, the name for your project. Names should not be one used already on PyPI. They're unique identifiers and used in URLs. A valid name consists only of ASCII letters and numbers, period, underscore, and hyphen, and the names must start and end with a letter or number. A package that works with Django, it's a good idea to have Django in the name. That way you're not taking up module namespace that could be used for names for other projects, and also shows that your project is Django specific. Don't name your app so it conflicts with an existing one of the installed apps, and avoid using names that Django has already used, like auth, admin, or messages. Also, it's a good idea not to use an obscenity or offensive words or dirty jokes in your name, because people may use and discuss your app at work, and also it's a good idea to be respectful of your users. So version numbering is important. It's used to differentiate one release from all your other releases. So version numbers must be unique, and they must also be numbered so they consistently increase. And PEP 440 has many things to say about version numbers, and I recommend that you follow it. And PEP 440 recommends A.B.C versioning, and you can use either incremented numbers or the year and month of your release. Please have docs. It's recommended that you build your docs using Sphinx. Upload your docs to read the docs so your users can find them. And in addition to doing that, include your docs in the package. If you do something weird or awesome or cool or hacky, document it. Document your dependencies. If you include any custom forms or templates, please document those. And I'd like to remind you now, though I'm sure you know, doc strings are not documentation, auto-generated documentation is not documentation, and code is not documentation. Documentation is at minimum full sentences in a human language telling your users the following: how to install the package, which versions of Django and Python it works with, what dependencies are, even if they're automatically installed, all of your app's public API, all of its models, views, and forms, what they're for, what they do, and what the user is expected to do with them, how to install the app in the user's project, how the user should change their settings.py and config items, where to find the source code for the project and report bugs or suggest features. And I'm banging on about documentation because it's really important. One time when I was a more beginning programmer, I was doing a project with sockets, and sockets are finicky little beasts. You have to do all kinds of weird things like close them and then reopen them, and what I was doing was not working. So I thought, oh, I'll get a library to handle all that low-level stuff, and I'll just have a nice API that I can plug things into. It'll work great. And so I found this library, and I was like, oh, great. Like, I found this thing. It looks really good. It looks like it's going to do what I want. And then I kept trying to find documentation online for it, and I couldn't find it. And so finally I went and downloaded the code for this library, and I found this like directory called docs, and I thought, oh, awesome, it's got documentation like packaged with it. This is really cool. So then I downloaded Sphinx, and I built the docs, and it was empty. So I did not use that library in my project. I don't remember what it was, but I can't imagine that many people are using it because they can't figure out how. It's also a good idea in your package to include a README. And the README can double as a long description for the purposes of PyPI. The README is sometimes the first thing that potential users and contributors will see about your project. It's not a replacement for full documentation, but provides enough information so your users can find out what your app does and if it will work for them. It's a good idea in your README to provide a link to the full documentation for your project and provide information on dependencies and how to get the app working in a minimal kind of way. It's also a good idea in a README to tell your users what level of support to expect, whether the project is actively maintained and updated, or whether it's a one-off project that you've made available, and how much time and effort you're going to put in maintaining it. You have a couple options for the format of your README on PyPI, which include GitHub-flavored Markdown, Common Mark, plain text, and restructured text. This is my mention of licenses. If you plan to distribute your project so people outside your company can use it, please add a license. And this is a site that will ask you some questions and allow you to choose an appropriate license for releasing your code under. So now we are up to the part where you take your package and turn it into a distribution. The first thing I'm going to talk about is a package called setuptools. It contains a function called setup, which is a function with a lot of arguments. It is the build script to make your package in a consistent way that can then be installed on other people's computers. And it provides metadata about your package to PyPI and end users. And I'm going to speak briefly about a few of setuptools' arguments. It's a good idea to work with your users' versions of dependencies and avoid conflicting with things that your user may already have installed. And it's a good idea to aim to allow all versions of Django that have upstream support. It's also best to specify version ranges of dependencies that your app will work with, and specify the app's other dependencies as broadly as possible. It's also a good idea to accommodate your users' different versions of Python, and to write for the versions of Python that Django supports, which includes 2.7 until 2020. Setup also allows some arguments to be passed which are classifiers, which are like tags that allow for searching. And it's a good idea to include versions of Python that your package works with, which license your package uses, which OS it works on, and which versions of Django your app works with. Setup.py has a command line tool called setup.py upload. Please do not use this. Setup.py upload may use HTTPS depending on your system, which is not secure, or it may not use HTTPS depending on your system, which is not secure. And it's a good idea to use a tool called Twine instead, which I'll mention in a minute. It's also a good idea to include some non-code files, and this is how you do it. You include package data equals true to the setup function, which reads a file called a manifest.in, which specifies non-Python files to include in your package. So if you want to include documentation, which is a good idea, you can also include your README, any data files, and a license file. There's also a tool called checkmanifest, which is for checking your manifest.in files against the files you have checked into Git, so you don't leave out something important. It's also a good idea to keep in mind to use setuptools and not distutils. Distutils is a package in the standard library for building distributions. It was created in 1998 and is in the process of being phased out in favor of setuptools. Setuptools is essentially a dropped-in replacement for distutils, and it allows you to declare dependencies on other packages. Setuptools has consistent behavior across Python versions, unlike distutils, and setuptools is also more frequently updated than distutils. Now I'm going to make a little detour and discuss briefly the difference between requirements.txt and setup.py. Setup has an argument called install requires that specifies other packages that your app depends on. Setuptools is for specifying dependencies and metadata for a package. However, requirements.txt is a list of packages and their versions generated for a specific environment by pip freeze. So requirements.txt is essentially a set of arguments for pip install when you're replicating someone else's virtual environment and doesn't affect the packages themselves. So now, distributions are versioned instances of your app. And there are two file formats to upload your package in: a wheel or built distribution and a source distribution. Pip preferentially installs built distributions, but you should upload both built and source distributions to PyPI. And setuptools can create both in one shot, and I will show you how in a minute. Wheel is a special package for working with the wheel file format. Wheels are the standard Python distribution file format and are compressed files that just has the code for your distribution, and it ends in WHL. And I'm sure if you've pip installed things, you've seen this like scroll past in your terminal. Wheel distributions just have to be moved to the right location in the file system to be installed, and offer faster installation of pure Python, and installing compiled C extensions with them doesn't require a compiler. When you're creating your wheel, specify a universal wheel because it doesn't care what platform it's being installed on and doesn't compile specific things for like Linux or Windows or whatever. So wheel comes from the old name for PyPI, which was called the cheese shop back when it had far fewer packages on it. So now we have hundreds of thousands of packages on PyPI, and we stopped having a cheese shop and we have a warehouse. Oh, the joke in the Monty Python sketch was that the man was trying to buy cheese in a cheese shop, but the cheese shop had no cheese. So why build source distributions? Source or archive distributions contain tests, docs, and code. And it's a good idea to build them because people may want to download your code so they can look at it or modify it, or want to have the docs and code together, like I did when I was looking at that sockets library, or they want to build your code for a different architecture such as ARM. In Python packaging, you might have come across something called an egg. It's similar to a wheel, but it's an earlier version of it. It's a zip file with metadata, and it's a built distribution with Python bytecode. Eggs have largely been superseded by the wheel format. Please do not make eggs. Eggs do not unzip themselves when they're installed, so you need special file loaders to get access to the things inside, like translated pages. Django no longer ships with these loaders, and also pip does not support eggs anymore. And why are they called eggs? Because Pythons lay eggs. So now before creating your package, make sure you have the latest versions of setuptools and wheel. And then you create your package. And in this example, the sdist is the source distribution and the bdist is the built distribution. So now it's time to upload your package, and I'm going to discuss using a tool called Twine. It is a tool specifically for uploading files to PyPI, and it's named for tying up packages with Twine. It's a good idea to use Twine instead of setup.py upload, not just because of the security considerations. Twine will upload over HTTPS by default, which is not necessarily the case with a setup.py upload. And Twine only acts as an uploader. You have to build your distribution first using setuptools. You can upload any package format with Twine, including wheels. And one of the reasons why I don't recommend using setup.py upload is because it builds and uploads the project in a single step, whereas with using Twine, you just have the upload step and you can check that your code works the way you want it to before uploading it. So this is how you upload with Twine. Note that I have passed a site that is not the PyPI URL as an argument. This is test.pypi.org. It uses the same code as pypi.org, but it allows you to upload a package as a test and essentially acts as a sandbox. It's a good idea to upload here first, just to make sure that your description and files look okay and your package is the way you want it before you release it into the wild on PyPI. It's a good idea to check the README that you included in your setup.py renders correctly, so you don't have to bump the version on PyPI to correct a typo or formatting issue. And also, it's a good place if you want to make a toy project to learn this process or do any packaging for fun, to upload it here instead of putting it on PyPI where everyone can get to it. Finally, it's time to think about the future of your package. Don't upload your package and forget about it. Upload your code to GitHub or another code hosting site so people can have a place to file issues and make PRs. Tag your releases on your code hosting site so people can see the code where you made your releases. Put your docs on Read the Docs, please. Respond to bug reports and PRs when people file them. And also, it's a good idea to have an email address with GPG keys if you roll that way, where people can report security issues without having to post them publicly on your code hosting site. And make sure that this email address is not your personal email address, just so that in case you want to hand off to another maintainer, you're not receiving emails about your project forever. Regularly run tests against your project installed with any new versions of Python or Django that are released and fixed any issues. And finally, I would like to thank James Bennett and Russell Keith McGee, Katie McLaughlin, Phil James, and Nick James for their help with this talk. All the errors in it are my own, and it would not be what it is without their help. And finally, here are some useful resources for packaging that I found in the process of making this talk, and I hope you enjoy them and consider making packages of your own.
All right. Thank you so much, Laura. It was a pleasure to have you back on stage.
It was a pleasure to be
and
here.
of course, we have your water bottle.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
It is upgraded from last
It is upgraded from last year. There's a magnetic clasp and everything. It's quite nice.
It's lovely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. One more hand for Laura, please.